invalid argument. Right? So this leads us to tonight's discussion about the final monster form, which is the human. The human is the proper monster, right? We seek ourselves in these monstrous forms. We seek ways of understanding ourselves in these monstrous forms, but the monster as a mirror is a broken mirror, right? So we only are able to see ourselves refracted in ways that are fractured. And so then I think the project, if the human form is the proper monster, we have to learn to see ourselves not as reflected, but as constituted. So there's two ways I think that we can do this, where there are at least two human figures that represent monsters in the classical sense of that term of monstrosity. One is through madness, and one is through what we might think of as possession or possessed of the anti-divine, the demonic, which will come out in the form of the witch. So we have these two categories of the mad scientist, and then we have this category of the witch. I'll deal with the mad scientist first, because even though it's second in the title, it's necessary to understanding, I think, how the witch factors in. The mad scientist, one may wonder whether or not this is actually a monster, more than, say, a caricature of the scientifically eccentric. But the monstrosity of the archetype is present in the abnormality or characterization, if not explicitly in the character of the scientists themselves. The mad scientist is as much an outcome of scientific pursuit as Godzilla, The Fly, Alligator People, if you're familiar with 50 B movies, or even the Incredible Hulk in a superhero vein. So let me give you a couple of mad scientists that probably come to mind immediately when you hear this invocation of the mad scientist as monster, right? So in January 1818, Mary Shelley will write Frankenstein. Dr. Victor Frankenstein, as a scientist, is attempting to emulate the divine, right? To recreate the human from material matter, right? To the collection of material stuff to make a human. And what this is, right, is an inversion of the understanding of us made in God's image. That's the standard way that we tend to think of in the West, our relationship to God. We are made in God's image. Frankenstein is attempting to remake God in man's image. And this is the contortion of science as a form of knowledge, where we think that what science allows us to do is elevate the human to the divine. And this is the monstrous element, right? It's essentially the contortion of the inner being of humanity. Which then gets us to January 1886 with the publication of Jekyll and Hyde. Dr. Henry Jekyll, the scientist, is sort of a representation of the attempt to improve upon the personal, to plumb the personal nature of his existence, and in doing so, he brings out the monstrous form of Mr. Hyde, which could be his subconscious sort of materializing. There's ways to think of it in that way, but ultimately, Mr. Hyde is to Dr. Jekyll a contorted sense of being, right? An irresponsible way of being. If you're familiar with the story, Mr. Hyde is sort of an out-of-control character, which is Freud's id unchecked. And then we get to Dr. Moreau, which doesn't give it, he's given a first name in the movie, but not in the actual book. But Dr. Moreau, the island of Dr. Moreau for H.G. Wells was science sort of reaching its penultimate ability to take animal forms and reconstitute them, to remake the world in a functional way. So he puts animals, he carves them up in vivisection, puts them together, and creates a whole race of people in the book known as beast people. And they are under his control. And there's some real questions about the beast people as a manifestation of his desire to become God, or potentially, but just the desire to make, the desire to craft a being, which then gets us to the modern age. And I'm not going to ruin this one for you, so I'm not going to talk about it at length. I'm just going to encourage you to go get a copy of this book and read it. In Margaret Atwood's Words and Crate, the figure of Clint, who is Crate in the book, he's only given the name Glenn. He attempts to take all of these sorts of the content of Victor Frankenstein and Henry Jekyll and Dr. Moreau, and sort of channels them into the not the creation of new people. That's not the end goal. The end goal is the eradication of humanity, where humanity is the monstrous form. In order to preserve what is good in the world, humanity has to be erased. And this is sort of, I think, the natural destination of science on a historical arc, that we have sort of come to understand ourselves parasitically, though we won't admit it. And this is why I think that the world is sort of in the situation it's in. But let me take mad scientist fictional caricature and map that onto mad scientist, the actual scientist. Francis Crick, you probably know because he helped discover DNA, was actually more popular during his lifetime for his theory of panspermia, directed panspermia, which is the idea that extraterrestrial beings purposely seeded the planet with little humanoid seeds, and this is all a big science experiment. Francis Crick believed that if we were able to figure that out, our extraterrestrial origins would allow us to become enlightened. You're probably familiar with theories like this if you've watched Ancient Aliens on the History Channel. Usually only do that for entertainment purposes. Those people are crazy. But that's just me, right? Another person that probably jumps out if you know anything about sort of actual mad scientists is William Buckland, who was well known during his time for a number of scientific discoveries. But one of the things that he actually did a lot of was consume everything. He ate everything you could eat, including rumors of the human heart of French royalty. And so he had this idea of consumption at the heart of what it meant to understand another thing's being. And his attempts at doing science well included the literal consumption of otherness, which I think harkens back to our discussion of the stranger and the need for consumption. Jose Delgado is a scientist who did some mind control experiments and with implanted devices in dogs' brains so he could control the dogs and get them to do his bidding. That seems pretty far-fetched until I tell you at Duke University there is right now a chimpanzee that has technology embedded in its brain that allows a chimpanzee in North Carolina to think a thought and operate a robotic arm in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And so when the chimpanzee sits in a room and looks at a TV screen with a banana and thinks, I want the banana, a robot arm in Massachusetts reaches out and grabs the banana. And so that technology exists largely because of what Jose Delgado was doing, and also some MK-Ultra experiments with the CIA. I don't want to go into conspiracy theories, but that technology exists as well. And this, again, is, I think, a process of overcoming, where science leads us to believe that humanity is an obstacle to this ability to achieve the divine. A Russian gentleman named Sergei Bruganoko, I think I'm pronouncing that right, probably not. He's famous as the Soviet Frankenstein. He actually performed an experiment where he decapitated dogs and kept their heads alive using mechanical apparatus to feed oxygen and blood into their head. So he sort of pioneered what would become the technology that is made famous by Futurama, right? The room with all the heads, if you're familiar, right? That is a play on his scientific experiments. He was quite successful. He also pioneered sort of technologies and techniques for organ transplantation, but he actually operated on animals while they were alive, so he could he'd take animals and take their hearts out and swap them and see what would happen as a result. Another Russian named Ilya Ivanov was made famous because of his scientific experiments to crossbreed humans and chimpanzees. So first, he tried to take male sperm, human sperm, and put it into female chimpanzees, and when that didn't work, he went back to Russia, solicited volunteers for male chimpanzees to try to impregnate human females. He got 5 volunteers. Like some of this stuff you can't make up, right? And so there's, if you look at all of, and this is just a short list for discussion purposes, but if you look at sort of the history of science, the caricatures that come out in fiction that predate these experiments by hundreds of years are not happening in isolation. Science is working on these projects, and so I think there is this sense of overcoming humanity embedded in this notion of science as a way of knowing. And that's incredibly problematic, I think. And so this leads to, I think, what we might think of as the cyborg interlude, right? We live in an age of augmented reality. Lots of people are finding ways to embed technology in their existence. A lot of dystopian entertainment features humans that are technologically enabled. And this raises questions of what it means to be a human. At what point does humanness stop? At what point do we cease to be a human and start to be something else? That's a live question right now. And if we're going to ask that question of ourselves, then we have to ask a similar question, which is why do we think it's possible to overcome humanness? Why is that desirable? Where does that originate in?